So any given article tends to have a certain formula behind it, and it's important to know this formula because once you know the formula, it becomes kind of comforting. You can have certain assumptions about what each section will entail. So the abstract of a journal article is kind of like a preview of the article. It lets you know a little bit more about what you can expect from the study, and it gives you a good frame and context with which you can approach the article. So it's really good to read the abstract to kind of center you a little bit about what you can expect to encounter during the course of the article and what sorts of things you can pay attention to. The introduction is where the author presents background research, the purpose of the study at hand, and a little bit more about the hypotheses of the study. I'm going to go ahead and say that when people are first learning about how to read journal articles, they spend way too much time on the introduction section, struggling with trying to understand the theories and paying way too much attention to all the little details. I would say the introduction is tended to provide you with context and to basically give you enough background so that you can understand why the researchers expected what they expected. But I honestly wouldn't spend too much time on the introduction. Just make sure you know the basic research question and what sort of hypotheses they had, and then you'll be in fairly good shape. The heart of the article, the most important part, is the methods and results. The methods tell you what was done, who the participants were, and what they experienced. And the results tell you what they found, so what the different groups did in terms of how they differed exactly on the outcomes that were being measured. So this is the important part. This is the part you really want to pay attention to. This is the part where the actual exciting new information comes in rather than previous research. The discussion is where the authors reflect on what they did and what they found, what they think about it, what it implies, what the strengths of the studies are, what they need to do for future research. The references section is a collection of all of the sources that they've cited throughout the article, especially the sources they've cited for background research in the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and say that the references page is a really great collection of resources that you could potentially use. So if you find one good article, you've actually found about 30 because you can take a look at that article's references to find similar sources about that topic. When it comes to summarizing an article, I would say you want to focus on the parts or detail that you need and not on the stuff that you don't. So for example, I never want to know the number of participants that were in a study unless that's a point of critique. I don't necessarily need to know about where the author is from or what sort of participants were used in the study, unless, once again, that's a point of critique. So I tend to really hone in on the methods and results and not necessarily paying too much attention to the fine detail, but using broad strokes. So not necessarily focusing on the specific questionnaires that were used or the individual items, but what in general was measured and how. And it's an important skill to learn, but to be able to really take an article and disseminate it into one or two sentences of the key findings. I call this the elevator pitch, to be able to say to someone, hey, I read a really cool study the other day and here's what they found in one or two sentences, is a really useful and valuable skill to kind of distill a study into the basic key conclusions that you can come to. And the way I like to think about it is that you probably could spend 1 to 2 sentences talking about what was done in the methods section and 1 to 2 sentences talking about what they found in the results section. Keep in mind that the results are the most important part, and you want to provide just enough of the procedure to give the results context. So for example, if you take the time to say group A experienced this and group B experienced that, then when you say group A was higher on the outcome than group B, it makes a little bit more sense. So you need to do a little bit of background on the procedure so that when you say group A was higher, then people know what went into it and why group A might have been higher because of what they experienced. When it comes to finding out what is the key finding or findings, it can sometimes be challenging to wade through an article and really identify those things. I would recommend taking a look at the abstract, which will tell you what the most important findings were, and taking a look at the very start of the discussion section where authors usually summarize the results that they found. I would also say that if an author decides that something is important enough to make a figure of it, that's also something you should take a look at. Take a look at the patterns that you see in the figure. If it's a bunch of lines, which lines are higher and which ones are lower? If it's a bunch of bars, which bars are higher and which ones are lower? And what are they associated with? That's a really great way to see if you're understanding what the study is about. For example, if it has two different bars and one bar is group A and the other bar is group B, it's important for you to know what group A and group B were in terms of how they differed from one another, and also what's on that y-axis, what is actually being measured as the outcome. This is something I wanted to go into a little bit more detail about in terms of critique. So when you are reading an article and you are reflecting on it later and having a conversation about it, for example, it's not enough to say that you don't like it or don't agree with the findings. That's not how science tends to work. So for example, the findings exist whether or not you agree with them. There are very specific things that you can focus on when it comes to critique. So one of the things you can critique is the author's interpretation of results. So for example, once again, the pattern of findings exists. The author's interpretation of why those findings exist in that pattern is something that you can take a look at and go, I think differently. I think it's due to something different going on. So you could identify an alternative explanation for the pattern of results that is different from the author's interpretation. You can critique the methods. You can say, here's how I'd make the experiment better to reduce bias or to eliminate an alternative cause. You can critique the population, and you can determine whether the results might be different with a different population. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say this. Most people go with the third method of critique when they're first learning about research. And I would go ahead and say, go ahead and start with that. That's fine. That's an interesting thought exercise. However, I don't want you to just stop at saying, well, I think it would be different if it was studied in a different country. I really want you to think about how it would be different and why it would be different. It's one thing to say, oh, it'd be different if it was a non-college population. It's another to actually carefully consider what an older population might do that's different and how exactly they would differ. So really be specific when you're thinking through how it might be different with a different population. One of the things I'm asking you to consider when it comes to your group project is a potential follow-up study to an experiment that you've read as part of class. I wanted to go through just a little bit more about what I mean by that. So when I say I want you to ask a follow-up question or propose a follow-up study, what I'm thinking about there is that you would basically be asking a question that was left unanswered in the original experiment and design an experiment to test that question. A good follow-up question mixes things up a little bit. You don't want to necessarily just repeat what the original study did and see if you get the same results. That's a replication. That's different. I'm asking you for a follow-up or expansion where you're expanding the boundaries a little bit of our understanding rather than repeating it again. So a good follow-up question changes up something where you're exploring whether a different population would actually differ. You're adding in a new condition or a new variable and studying how that adds into the mix and enriches our understanding of the phenomenon in question. You're combining one theory with another. You're saying, here's theory X, here's theory Y, let's mash them up and see what happens when we study both of them in an experiment together to see how they influence one another. The key is that a follow-up question that is good expects a different pattern of results. If your hypotheses are all exactly the same as the original study, it's a replication, it's not an expansion. And once again, to my point earlier about population, you have a good empirical reason for why you expect it to be different. So it's not just, I think it'll be different, but you actually have clarified how it will be different and why, using research to support your logic.